In this video I'll be talking about how the knights move in chess, and I'm going to begin to talk about, or I'll begin by discussing the knight that's on the b8 square, the black knight on b8. And it's important to note that knights move in really what's like a capital L shape. They move in a pattern that's a 2-1 pattern. I always say a 2-1. So this knight on b8 was going to move. It's basically going to move like a capital L. 2 squares in one direction, and then 1 next to it, if you think of it that way. So it's going to actually move like 2 squares forward and 1 square sideways. That's an option. Now it didn't have to move to the right. I just chose that one because it looks like a capital L. It could have moved 2 squares down and then 1 square left, so it could go to that square. So it's important to note that at this point in time, that knight can technically move to the squares of which are highlighted now, because those squares are basically your L pattern, where you go 2 squares one direction and 1 in another direction. So this is not the only 2 squares that this knight can play to. Actually, I'll give you might want to pause the video to see if you can find there is one more square that knight can move to legally at this point. But I will show you now that it actually could move 2 squares to the right and then 1 square down, and this would be a legal square for that knight to move to. So to begin this game, in which I've put the knights in their starting positions in a game, the knight on b8 here has the option basically to move to one of those green squares. So I'm going to move the knight I'm going to make the move knight to c6. So this knight is going to end up moving to that square on c6. Now, next knight, it's white's turn. I'm going to discuss the knight on g1. So I'm going to discuss this knight on g1. And it too moves like a capital L in a 2-1 pattern. And if you caught on, or you know knights a little bit, maybe you want to find this 3 squares that this knight can move to on your own by pausing the video. But this knight can move 2 squares forward and 1 square sideways. So that knight can land on this square, or it could have gone 1 square sideways in the opposite direction on that square. So the knight on g1 has the option to move to one of the highlighted squares, or it could have gone 2 squares left and 1 square up to land on this square, the e2 square. And so it's important to note again that knights move like a capital L. It's a 2-1 pattern that you have to see and get used to. The white knight here is going to move to the e2 square in this case. Now, it's also important to note for knights, generally speaking, knights tend to be more powerful when they are moved more towards the center of the board. Now, there's never a 100% you must do this rule in chess, because chess is always positional, and what you should do is determined by what pieces are on the board and where they are. But as a quick note, I just want you to take a look at the 2 knights that I had moved. So this knight, the black knight on the c6 square, has a lot of squares that it can move to right now. And remember, it's a bunch of 2-1 patterns, a bunch of capital L's shifted or flipped around the knight. And I'll tell you the truth, there's actually 8 of them. And if you want to pause the video and try to find all 8 to see if you understand how a knight moves, go for it. But I'm going to show you what they are. So let's start with this. It could move down 2 over 1. There's your typical capital L. So the knight could move to this square. That's one option. It could move down to left 1. So it could move to this square. Okay, those are really the down and over moves. Now I've got to cover the, maybe it goes right 2. That means it could go now down 1. It's a 2-1 pattern, remember, so go to this square. Or maybe it went right 2 and up 1, so now it can go to this square. Now I've taken care of all of the moves to the right. Now maybe the knight goes up 2, right 1. It's a 2-1 pattern. All of these are 2-1 patterns. It could move to this square. or maybe it goes up to left 1, and now it could move to that square, which takes care of the 2 upper moves. Now I can take a look if it moves left 2, down 1, this square, or left 2, up 1, to this square. And I hope you can see the huge pattern here that this knight has. This knight is controlling 8 squares on the board, the 8 green highlighted squares. It's really basically a circular pattern. So this knight is controlling 8 squares on the board. There are 64 squares on the board. It's controlling 8 of them, if you will. Compare that to the number of squares that, let's say, the white knight on b1 is controlling. Okay, well, the white knight on b1 is only controlling 3 squares, and I'll show you those. Before I do that, let's remove these for the black knight. But the white knight on b1 is only controlling 3 squares. Now the knight can move to a3, c3, or d2. Those are its options. So this knight is only controlling 3 squares, while the dark knight, the black knight, on c6 is actually controlling 8 squares. Which basically is a general rule in chess is you want your knights to be a little bit more centralized. You want a lot of your pieces to have power more towards the middle of the board. There's sayings in chess like knights on the side are fried. Well, people who say that are saying that because when your knight is on the side of the board, as in this b1 knight, they're saying it's fried because it loses power in the sense that it's only controlling 3 squares as opposed to what it could be controlling towards the middle of the board, which is 8 squares. So one of the strategies in knights is to give them the most power as you can, and I can't tell you never move it to the side because that would be false, but generally speaking you do weaken the power of the piece, or you weaken the number of squares that it can control when you do move it to the edge of the board. So keep that in mind as you move knights. Try to keep them maybe more centralized, but again it depends on the position on the board. So I'm going to continue moving in this game. The next move, let's see, last move we had was knight e2, so the last move we had was this knight, that was the white knight to e2. So the black is going to move their knight, knight to h6, knight to h6, meaning that the black knight is going to move forward 2 and right 1, so that it's going to land on the h6 square. And so black decides to move knight to h6. And I'll move a couple more moves here. I'm going to play white knight to c3. And in this position here, it's kind of interesting because both of these white knights are able to move to the c3 square. Make sure you can see that. That's kind of important to note. The knight on the e2 square is allowed to move there by that pattern. The knight that's sitting on the b1 square can also play there by this pattern. So both of these white knights are allowed to play to that square. Well, white has the option to move either one. They choose to move that knight there. Right now, black plays knight to e5, knight to e5, and white plays knight to e4, knight to e4. So white's going to choose to play this knight to e4 in the 2-1 pattern like that. Okay, so white plays knight to e4. Now, black decides to play knight to f5. Make sure you can see that move, knight to f5. And white decides to play a move, knight to f6, and I need to talk about this because I have not mentioned it yet. Knight to f6 means that the knight has played 2 up and 1 over in the natural 2-1 pattern for knights. And note what just happened. It doesn't capture the black knight. It does not capture the knight that it is passing over here. Okay, knights are the only piece in a chess game that can actually jump over. They can jump over other pieces, and that's what happens here. Technically, the knight does not slide through the black knight. it technically, and realistically, is jumping to a new square. So I keep drawing these arrows to show you the pattern 2-1, but technically what the knight is doing is it's jumping over everything and landing on that square. That's technically what's happening. So when you actually move a knight, you can never take anything that it's passing through, because what you're doing is the knight is leaving the board and reappearing on a different square. It's jumping over everything. That's very different because it's the only piece that behaves that way. So white chooses to play that knight f6 piece. Has just jumped over those other two knights. Black decides to play knight to d7. See if you can find that move. Knight to d7. And now we have reached this point where the white knight on f6 actually has the option to capture that black knight right there, because that black knight has now moved to a square where the white knight can move. And white is definitely going to do that when they have that opportunity, and so white chooses to capture that knight. Then black plays knight to d4. Knight d4, and they've actually made another mistake. See if you can find it. There's a knight here. The white knight on e2 will be allowed to capture that knight because it is in a 2-1 pattern, and they indeed will. So, things to know about the knight. The knight moves in the 2-1 pattern. The knight leaps over every piece. It does not capture anything unless it lands on it, finishes its move there. Knights do control more squares when they're centralized, when they're near the center of the board, because I'll note that one more time. This d4 knight controls 8 squares. Those 8 squares happen to be these 8 squares, and you can see it's a circular region around the knight. The other thing to note, by the way, that you might find useful, or maybe in a more advanced, when you get more advanced at chess, is this knight that I was looking at is on a dark square. When it moves next, it will land on a light square, guaranteed. It has to. Okay, so whatever color the knight is currently sitting on, it will always land on the opposite color, and that might help you also. So this knight is currently, the knight at d7 is on a light square, a white square. And if I were to find all of its possible moves, they actually happen to all be dark squares, because that is the nature of the knight. Now this knight happens to be closer to the edge of the board, so it actually does not controlling 8 squares, it's controlling 6. You can see the 6 that I have highlighted, the other 2 are off the edge of the board. So those are some key things to remember about knights. There are some other features of knights that are very nice, especially forks, but that will be covered in a different video. So good luck using your knights and learning how they move and how they can jump over other pieces.